Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are joining us in from. If this is the first time you're ever seeing my face, my name is Dr. Glory Edozian, and I'm a LinkedIn visibility and thought leadership expert for speaker and board ready women. And I'm really, really, really excited today because I have a phenomenal guest who is a female leader herself, but who is also a champion of female leadership and has done a lot of work and has a lot of insights into the data. So a lot of times we as female leaders, we speak to the issues we see and experience, but it's always good to see somebody who has a wider experience, one for herself and also in terms of the data and the insights that drive some of the things that we see on the ground. So I'm super, super excited to welcome my guest today. But before I welcome her, I'd just like for you to please tell us your name and where you're joining in from. It can feel a little lonely on the LinkedIn live stage because you can't see your faces. So please just tell us your name in the chat. Tell us where you're joining in from. I always like for these lives to be interactive. So please, if you have a question, if we say something that strikes a chord, if you want to contribute, please just make sure you type that in the comment section and I will always spotlight it. Okay, so let me introduce our guest today. We have Mayowa Kuyoro. Mayowa, did I get that right?
You
Your
did,
last
you did, you
I
did.
did?
Yes.
Okay, I've
Yeah.
been fussing about that all day. I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure. Mayowa Kuyoro, and she's associate partner at McKinsey, the Lagos office in McKinsey. And she supports donors, foundations across Africa, and she also leads the fintech and payment practice for Eastern Europe, Middle East, and the African region. So she has I will be asking her a lot of questions because she has a lot of experience in emerging markets as well. And when I was talking about insights, Mayowa has led on landmark research for women as economic agents for a large philanthropic organization. And she has also co-led review of women in leadership and workplace across three emerging markets, which is what I believe we're going to be talking about today. Mayowa, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Fleury, and it's great to have everyone on the LinkedIn Live. Thanks for creating this opportunity. I'm really excited.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, Mara, this is our edition of Female African and on Boards, where we like to unpack experiences of female leaders, like I said earlier. And today we're really going to be unpacking some of the important research that you have co-led, right? And this is the McKinsey's Women in the Workplace report across Nigeria, Kenya, and India. But before we get into that, just tell us a bit about yourself. Set the scene for us. Who is Maiwa beyond the title? Just set the scene for us a little.
Thank you. Mayowa is a very bad tennis player.
Okay.
uh, very, very bad, but I love it. No, on a more serious note, I always start by identifying as an African, someone who grew up and my purpose and my I would say my raison d'être is to be a part of Africa's economic renaissance, and I've dedicated my career to working on the continent. I live in Nigeria, and as you rightly said, I serve clients across mostly emerging markets. In my spare time, I play a lot of tennis very badly. I would say very badly because as soon as you say you play tennis, I would say, oh yeah, let's play. And I don't want to go and disgrace myself outside. But I play a lot of tennis in my spare time. And my aim this year is to try to read a book a month. I haven't been successful, but that's what I'm trying to do for 2025.
Amazing. I love that. Read a book a month. I struggle. I've been trying to do that this year. I've managed to do two books in 6 months. I don't know what that says about me, but at least I'm on the journey. I'm on the journey. Fantastic. Good, good, good. So guys, if you're joining in, please tell us your name and what city you're joining in from. And feel free to join the conversation via the comment section. So, Maya, you know what I said earlier around unpacking female leadership experiences. I really would like to know what has been what personal experience has shaped your understanding about the barriers or maybe the lack of barriers, depending on, what your experience is, women face in their leadership journey?
It's a very. I was reflecting a little bit actually on my journey as I was preparing for this, um, and I will use myself, but I actually don't like using myself because I think the way we drive change is at a system level. So my own experience can be different from your own experience, and so on and so forth. So I remember when I studied engineering in university, and I was one of four women who graduated out of a class of, call it maybe 100, 120. Um,
Okay.
and during my class, I was always underestimated. Rightly so, to be honest, because when the boys were getting excited about crankshafts and engines, honestly, I just was trying to just get out of there. But
Mm,
I graduated, and I moved into consulting. And to be honest with you, I did not, for the most part, think about myself as the like I was aware of gender when I was university, but at the workplace, not so much, especially when I was at junior levels. Where it became to become a thing for me was as I transitioned from entry level, managerial level into leadership level. And when you realize that more and more you are, the only, right? So, in fact, in some meetings, and this really became quite stark to me during COVID, when you're just staring at spaces on a screen. And sometimes I could be what I will call a triple only. I'd be the only woman, I'd be the only person of color, and I could be the only person from an emerging market on a call, right? And so you then
interesting.
begin to realize that in as you progress, there are less and less people who look like you, right? And have your own sort of shared background and shared experiences. Um, what I would say is that again, for in my own situation and in my own circumstances, I have never felt the limitation of being a woman. I have used it to my advantage. There's certain things that I cannot do that my male colleagues can do that I cannot do, but that doesn't bother me because in my mind I try and figure out a way out of every problem. But that is not the case and experience for a lot of other people, right? And the one that I always use as an example, so I cover emerging markets, which means I'm on a plane, you know, on a good month, I'm on a plane at least, 1 to 3 weeks a month. And just very recently, I had a junior colleague who was coming back, and we were discussing her reintegration plan. And they said, well, we should put her on a client in Kenya. And I'm like, I beg your pardon? This woman has a child that is less than 6 months old. How are we being supportive? And it didn't come from a place of malice or anything. It was just that most of the people who were having that conversation were men. So it did not occur to them that
Mm,
telling someone who's just coming back from maternity leave with a child that's less than 6 months to go on a client in Kenya is not creating a supportive environment for them, right? And so I think having more and more people who look like you help shape your experiences and help to um, just remove those barriers and those hurdles that make the journey a little less. I think statistically, people say that for sort of systematic change to happen, you need at least 30% of the decision makers to be of a
mm,
certain inclination and a certain inkling for you to have change that sticks, right? And as you look at, if you read the report, you see that across India, Nigeria, and Kenya, less than 30% of women are in senior leadership positions. So it's very difficult to create that enabling environment because you don't have the quorum that you need for change that sticks. So all this to say, like my own personal experience, I've been very, very privileged, but I also recognize that that's not the same for a high majority of women in the workplaces in our countries. And we need to do more to ensure that the people and decision makers, you have enough of a quorum that you can create the
mm.
right set of systematic change that will stick in our workplaces.
Yeah. Completely. I really like the phrase change that sticks, right? Because we want these hurdles. We don't want a situation where these hurdles are removed just for a period of time. right? But then there is this understanding of the different needs of each sort of diverse group, in order to create that sort of supportive environment. But this then brings me to this idea of representation, then brings me to my next question. And as we start to dig deeper into the report and the insights in the report itself, and we see this sort of steep drop off of female representation. So women are coming into the workforce and all of that at the same sort of level as men. But then when we start getting into sort of higher echelons of leadership, we have that steep drop off. But then again, when we look practically as what we see for a country like Nigeria, where for the first time in the last few years we've seen, high level females, in leading banks and top financial institutions in the country. How do you marry what the research is saying and what we are seeing practically on the ground? And what do you think is driving that shift?
It's a very, very good question. So I will take Nigeria and talk very specifically about Nigeria, because I think it applies exactly to the question you just asked. So Nigeria, our problem actually as women is not progressing the ladder. We have a drop off, right? We have a drop off, but it's not minor, and I'll come to it in a minute. The problem with Nigeria is actually barriers at the entry level. So if you look at formal workplace representation, Nigeria has, I think the number is 49.5 or 49 point something. Basically, the number of women who graduate from higher education is basically at par with the number of men that graduate from higher education. So we're 50-50 coming out of university. You then go to the school to work transition and you look at how many women at entry level. So for every one woman, right, that enters into the workplace in Nigeria, we have three men. So already the pipeline
Really?
is not full. Yes. So that 50% drops down to 30%, so just under 30% in Nigeria. By the
Wow.
time you now go from entry level to managerial level, I think it's like a 6 percentage point drop from entry level to managerial level, and then from managerial level all the way to CEO C level suite, it stays constant, but it's under 20. The number is
Really?
27%. Yes. So unless we
Interesting.
fix the number of women who are entering our workplaces, we are not going to have the pipeline we need to have
That's
full
low.
representation at the CEO level and CXO level, right? So Nigeria's problem is actually not necessarily like it's there. So I don't want to gloss over it. We do have
Mhm.
the drop from entry level to manager. Our problem is that we just don't have enough women entering the workplaces, especially our formal workplaces, coming out of university. So from 50-50 representation at university level to 30% representation at entry level, unless we we have enough coming into the funnel, and the funnel is like this, we will never
Mm.
have the parity that we seek at senior level position. So Nigerian women are very, very like they're very resilient. They're very, very they as soon as you pass managerial level, you don't see as much of a drop off. But what you have is that pre-managerial level, you have the drop off, and then you don't have enough women coming into the formal workplaces in Nigeria.
Really, I'm really surprised by that. Actually, so what is causing that shift?
So they're not, and which is why I use the word formal workplaces very, very intentionally, because when
Mm.
you look at Nigeria, Nigeria actually has the one of the highest rates of female entrepreneurships in the world, right? So one of
Mm.
our hypotheses is that instead of coming into what we call formal workplaces, a lot of women are going into informal trade, informal workplaces, and are being entrepreneurs. That is one of our hypotheses, but we haven't done the data to definitively say what causes the drop between the school to work and transition.
Interesting, interesting. So taking that a step further, one of the things I found really interesting in the report is that it seems when it comes to female representation, not every sector is equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, legal sectors in Nigeria and Kenya seem to have a steadier pipeline, compared to sort of like healthcare and finance. Do you think, or what do you think are the structural or cultural elements in those sectors that are contributing to this?
So it's something that we're actually very surprised by, because Nigeria, Kenya, even India had um, sort of a higher representation of women in the legal sector. And one of our hypotheses, and I always use the word hypothesis when we don't have the facts, because this is now
Mm-hmm.
the whys. So this is a
Mm-hmm.
hypothesis to be able to definitively say, yes or no. But basically, legal profession tends to have more linear tenure-based progression models, which can tend to
Mm-hmm.
reduce bias in promotions, right? And then also we heard anecdotally, and also when we were looking at the responses from the companies, a lot of top legal firms in this market have invested in mentorship networks. They've had sort of flexible practice models as well. And then also, you can be a legal, you can work in the legal profession. You can also be a company secretary, right? There's actually a lot when you look at the representation of women in our boardrooms and our exco rooms. A lot of women tend to hold what I call non-aligned roles or staff positions. So head of HR, head of legal. So in the legal profession is also something that actually attracts quite a number of women, just because of the career progression and the career options, even outside of being, a legal professional in in a litigation firm or so on and so forth. And so those are the kind of factors that we can attribute to seeing why you have more women in the legal profession.
I think that is interesting. But then why, compared to what is happening in the health sort of healthcare and finance space, that is different? Because you would, I mean, I would assume just looking at the people like doctors, nurses, and things like that, that you would have that sort of representation, and then even in finance as well. So, what do you think is the difference in those sectors?
So finance is not, again, this is just my own personal views, and it's not necessarily backed by rigorous empirical facts.
Mm-hmm.
um, so you take a country like Nigeria, and we talk about the fact that we're seeing a lot more women in C-suites in the finance sector.
Mm-hmm.
That is driven by regulation, right? Let's be very clear. CBN has, if you look at the licensing requirements, you look at some of their guidelines around who can be in excos, who can be in boards. They have some very clear guidelines around uh, um, um,
Diversity,
female
gender.
representation, right? Yeah, exactly. And that came in around the time where Sanusi was, or actually not, maybe not Sanusi, maybe it was Soludo was central bank governor. They've maintained it that way. The problem there, obviously, is that drop between entry level and manager, and it it can be a very how would I put it now? Very structurally unfriendly type of environment for women, right? Healthcare includes pharmaceutical, it includes not only sort of service professionals such as nurses and doctors, but again, you hear stories, and we interviewed women across the board. Some of the people in pharmaceuticals, for example, will tell us how they struggled, especially at entry level, because they were salespeople, right? And so you would have to travel a lot, right? Some of it was not necessarily, and even if this is domestic travel, not necessarily where you're going anywhere else, but domestic travel, you're going to regions where your safety is not necessarily guaranteed. And so it makes staying on, especially at entry level where you don't have a lot of agency, to be a bit more difficult than in other professions.
Amazing. I think this, these nuances within these different sectors, it's really interesting. I know you say this is not based on rigorous sort of empirical facts, as it were, but your observations, obviously, especially anecdotal sort of observations, are very useful in this conversation. And I think that observation around sort of the sustainable banking principles in Nigeria brings me to my next question around the implementation of diversity policies, right? And so there's policies and there's implementation, right? And obviously, as we would imagine, the report does have like a strong link between female representation with comprehensive gender diversity policies. But what practical implementation hacks can organizations adopt to actually make policies work?
So I'll talk about two things, right? The one thing is that when, how would I put it? First thing is a lot of companies don't measure. So before we go into implementation, people will say, they would say, "Oh, we have this thing here, we have this thing," and then I ask, "What proportion of your women are using this thing? What proportion
Mm,
of your women do you have in your pipeline?" It took us a year, it took us a whole year to gather the
wow.
data that you saw in that report. It took us a whole year to get it because companies don't track,
Hmm.
right? So on the one hand, you hear CEOs say gender diversity is a top priority, right? I think the number is around 60 something percent of CEOs say this is a priority. You ask how many people measure, it drops down. So I said seven, sorry, 77% who say it's a priority. 60% say they measure at any frequency, and 54% say they measure frequently, right? So people are not
Wow.
measuring, right? So
Hmm.
you can see the drop off. People are not measuring. And if you're not measuring, you're not going to know whether or not it's working or not
Hmm.
working. You can't know whether or not you need to tweak something or not. And so, like, it's fine. You can have it on paper, but if you don't know how what the effects of what you put on there is working, then it's purely eye service, as we would say in Nigeria. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that sometimes people also have to be aware that, so when you're measuring and you're tracking, okay, this thing is working, this is not working. People are not being penalized for taking up certain policies, right? So one that I always like to use is flexible working, for example. So if an organization says, you can work 2 days from home, one, whatever it is, but there's an unspoken rule that actually, if you work 2 days from home, kiss your promotion goodbye.
Hmm.
Use it. So it's not only enough to have these policies on paper, it's very important to make sure that the uptake, the design of the policies are 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 matching the problems and the issues you need to fix in your pipeline, right?
Hmm.
And then secondly, you are tracking the efficacy of this policy so that you know when you need to, tweak, when you need to refine the policies so that they can, actually end up with better outcomes for us.
I think that's really interesting because so we were coming from this work from home thing where organizations are now shifting in terms of how it's being applied, right? And you know that those types of policies have been sort of instrumental for women, especially the flexibility of work. I was talking to somebody the other day and she said she went for an interview and she was eyeing two jobs, both very senior, but one required her to be at work every day at 8 a.m and the other
Mm,
flexibility. And she said it was a no-brainer, even though the salary there was a bit of a salary difference. She would rather take some flexibility. So that just shows how these different, seemingly simple, flexible work policies can actually affect, where women decide to work. Okay, we have Dr. FFL says, great to be here. FFL, great to see you. Great to see you. Please feel free to ask your questions. Please let us know where you're joining in from today. If you have any questions for Mayowa, please, or even your own observations around some of the things we are discussing today, it would be great to hear you. My next question really is around global impact. So we've seen in places like North America a lot of pushback for DEI policy. And I wonder, do you see that affecting us in the emerging markets or even African corporations that are wanting to? Because I feel like we are just catching the bug, right? But there seems to be this pushback. Where
Yeah.
do you see that? How do you see that affecting us in the emerging market space?
So it actually differs by country. I say it differs by country. I've had various different conversations, for example, where in some markets people are like, "Thank God, this DI thing is over," and so on and so forth. And then in some markets where, look, to be, we take. I don't think, because let's take the Nigerian banking market for example. I don't think because the U.S. is reversing its stance um, on DEI that all of a sudden the central bank is going to say, well, all our guidelines around representation we're going to reverse. I actually don't, touch wood, knock on wood. I don't see
Mm-hmm.
that to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're not where the U.S. and other markets are, right? I think we're a bit more removed, and I think that this is one of the areas where we can even um, dance to the beat of our own drums, right? If you take Rwanda, for example, that has its own female-only legislative elections. In Senegal, where you have the targets for women representation, I just think that Africa as a whole has sort of dance to the beat of its own drum and being a bit more independent in terms of its stance towards DEI. So I think that it remains to be seen how we will see what effects we're going to have or what effects we're going to see. But at least I've scanned, I keep looking at the articles and news, and I haven't seen anything so far, at least, that points to our markets that we're going to be rolling back any of the regulations and any of the policies. And again, in the boardrooms that I'm in, I haven't seen any signs so far that people
Mm.
don't think it's something that should continue to be a big part of corporate agendas.
Amazing. I think that's great news, and I love the idea of us beating to our own drum and creating policies that work for us for our own corporate institution. So that's really great to hear. I want us to move now and talk about that 6% drop off from entry level to sort of managerial roles, right? And we've talked a lot about flexible work policies, but the report also recommends sort of structured career acceleration pathways, as well as some methods for sort of increasing female representation. In your view, what sort of practical acceleration models can help to close that 6% gap?
I think that the again, if I just take a step back and think about what are the interventions holistically for Nigeria. um, I think that we need to we need to plug the gap of the school to work transition. But then, as you said, from the entry level to managerial level, I think a couple of things need to be put in place and can be put in place to help stop that drop off. I think that things such as structured sponsorship programs with like clear criteria and also C-level involvement. So, are the execs being held accountable? Is it actually on someone's KPI, right? Is it on the CEO's KPI? Is it on the board's KPI that we're going to have X percentage female representation? Because what we all know, the adage, what gets measured gets done.
One.
So if this thing is on people's KPIs, then we're going to, I don't think that it's rocket science. We will see the changes that we need to see. I think the other thing is around clarity, right? Being clear about what you need to do in order to move up. There's a lot about the workplaces that is unsaid, right? And ensuring that there's transparency, there is clear performance metrics, clear promotion cycles. People know, these are the objective criteria that I need in order to accelerate my career, making it clear, and also
Mm.
being very, very deliberate again about the structural barriers that women face in the workplace, right? Things such as parental leave, right? And I use the word parental very, very carefully because I think that we talk a lot about maternity leave. We don't talk about paternity leave, which is also almost as equally as important. I say almost equally as important in terms of creating the right kind of supporting environment for women. Things such as um, um, what would you call that thing? Care policies around maybe crashes, maybe lactation rooms. One of the stories that and I've seen it myself, where women have to go into the bathroom to go
Mm.
pump, right? If I'm a mother, I'm just not encouraged to come back to the workplace, right? Also, what is the penalty that women face as well for taking time out of the workplace? So those are the things when you begin to remove those sort of barriers to progression. I think we can see the acceleration of career paths that we want to see.
So I think that's an interesting response, and I want to just broaden that agenda a little, right? So beyond, we've talked a lot about company in-house sort of company changes, right, and removal of systematic barriers. But I'm
Mhm.
wondering, beyond, what about societal pressures? And in fact, I really like what you said around maternity, paternity leave, and parental leave really being important. But in a country like Nigeria, and maybe I can only speak for Nigeria, but maybe it's the same in other emerging markets as well, where
Mhm.
the care of the child is solely, thought of solely as the mother's responsibility, especially in those sort of formative years. How
Mhm.
can What sort of societal changes do you think we need to see that can influence company policy?
Yeah. It's a great question. And we, in a report we wrote about 5 years ago, we talk about what is called unpaid care work. So you've highlighted child care, for example, parental care. Everybody has aging parents. Who does the burden of caring for aging parents fall on?
Mm,
The keeping up the house, right? Who is supposed to be responsible for that? So we actually see that in our markets, women have a disproportionate share of unpaid care work. That's actually what we call. That's what we call that particular phenomenon. So you've talked about, and so that's one element. Then cultural attitudes and notions around the role that women have to play both at work and in society, right? You hear stories of women who are professionals who are assumed to be the tea ladies, or you'll hear stories of, actually we interviewed someone in the oil and gas firm, and the lady said, I will not put a woman offshore. This was the HR person, who was a lady, by the way, right? Said, I will not put, and in technical careers, showing your reps around like technical skills is how you get promoted. But you put a barrier there saying that I'm not going to put women offshore. So those are the attitudes, the structural issues that need to be addressed, and the cultural norms that need to be addressed in order to help women to be more successful, right? And I think about it both at work but at home as well. So what are the norms and cultural mores that we need to address at work, and what are the cultural norms and mores we need to address in society in order to enable women to be successful? And each country has its own like nuances, but they exist and they need to be tackled systematically in order for us to see a change.
amazing. So it sounds, I mean, as I'm sure everybody that is listening to the conversation now and in the future will agree, it doesn't seem like either there is a one size fits all or just one area that we need to tackle in order to
Yeah.
ensure female representation, right? And that pipeline development, it's both in company, but also fundamentally the society that we also live in. So I have
Hmm.
two more questions and we'll start to wrap up. So if you have any questions, any comments in the chat, feel free to introduce yourself, tell us what city or country you're joining in from, and let us know your thoughts on the conversation we're having today. So one of the things that we're trying to do with my company Ascent is really to ensure more women get exposure into boardroom conversations, either through
Hmm.
non-executive director roles or board advisory opportunities.
Hmm.
What structural shifts do you think we need to move more women into boardrooms or executive teams in emerging markets?
So I think it cuts across the various different things I've talked about. I think one, we need to make sure that the pipeline is full so that we have enough women
Women.
to even push through the pipeline. So addressing the school to work transition. I think addressing the broken wrong
One.
from entry level into managerial and from managerial into a C-suite, and there are a range of things we've talked about: sponsorship, mentorship, care, bias, all those policies we know that will be good. I think also we need to ensure that, like I had mentioned before, I do think that it's important that KPIs begin to address the outcomes that we want to see. So are we asking people, are we holding people accountable? Are we ensuring that we're measuring? Are we ensuring that what we measure there are consequences if we don't hit what we want to get? And so on and so forth. I do think that we also need to ensure that there's succession planning with targets, so women are visible in the pipeline. And then I think also that we need to break this whole experience loop, right? Boards often seek prior board experience, but if you need to start somewhere, right? Which also perpetuates the exclusion that we see. So, I think there's a range of issues depending on what we're addressing. Sorry, a range of, I beg your pardon, interventions depending on what we're trying to address that can
Mm.
help us with addressing more diversity in leadership.
So, Mara, thank you for that response. And I have one more question, but I just thought of something now, right? So, in all of these sort of interventions that you've mentioned, these are things, if you've been in the women and leadership space, right, for a
Mm-hmm.
while, these are interventions that have been suggested, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you've been involved sort of like in Power of Parity report, I think it was, and now this new report. For you, is it, are you being involved in sort of these research, right? Are you encouraged
Mm-hmm.
by the insights that you are seeing on the
Mm-hmm.
ground? Are you encouraged? Do you think we're moving fast enough? What are your thoughts?
No, I definitely don't think that we're moving fast enough. I think that for in fact, I think we're moving the opposite direction in certain aspects of the
Mm,
parity and the diversity conversation. I think that
mm,
we need to. I think we need to actually. I think we need to begin to really hold, how would I put it, hold people's feet to the fire, right?
mm,
I think we have a chart. That chart that I always think about is how many CEOs say this thing is a priority. How many CEOs say that they actually get measured. They actually measure how many
mm.
CEOs are held accountable. 15%, only 15% of boards measure gender diversity. So
Wow.
unless we deal with those sort of underlying structural barriers, we're not going to
Mm,
see any progress. We're not going to see any change. So I think that
mm,
that for me is one of the biggest things that we need to address as part of this whole push towards parity for women. I think we need to just hold people accountable for what they say is priority for them, right? Because
mm,
we can talk ad nauseum about it. We can say we believe it. We can even put the policies in place. But unless
mm.
we're measuring, unless we're tracking, unless we're holding people accountable, we're not going to see any change and any movement.
Amazing. Thanks for that. And this is my final question. It's kind of like a cheeky A and B question, if you like, right? So
Yeah.
let's say we have a CEO or board chair who's watching this, and after they send an email or they give a call and they say, okay, look, this is something we're really interested in. What is one
Mm-hmm.
high impact action we can take today to really
Mm-hmm.
drive gender equity in our organization? So that's my A question. The B to that is, what would you say for organizations like mine, right, that are working to help women build visibility to attract these types of roles and senior leadership roles? What should we really be concentrating on, right?
Mm.
Where do you think is the gap where we can make the biggest sort of ripple effects, right? So that's the A and B side.
Yeah. So my answer to A is going to be what I said. I think you need to hold people accountable to what they say is priority. That is the very, very basic. We need to embed gender equity into performance contracts, right? Not just HR goals, but actually line leadership scorecards. If you're asking how many women leaders do you have? How many female, how many, I'm not even asking you today, what does your pipeline look like? How many women leaders do you have at level A and level B and level C and level C at level D? How are you grooming and ensuring that your organization reflects what society looks like, right? I think until that level of accountability, measurement and accountability happens, I don't think we're going to see system level change. So that one, is that one. I sound like a broken record, but I think for me, it's the missing link between attestation and reality, right? So I think that's the question on what should CEOs be looking at. I think on the question of what should your organization be doing, I think you're doing it already, right? I think you are putting a spotlight and ensuring that you're able to have the right conversations. I think that we also need to, as folks who are looking at gender and parity topics, also take the conversation beyond women, right? That I think I've not seen enough of, and even this is also, it's not criticism in general. It's like even us and the work that we do at McKinsey. I don't think we have enough of these conversations to broader audiences. Sometimes we're preaching to the choir,
To the
right?
choir.
And I'm real, my next, like the next thing I'm thinking of is how do we begin to have these conversations in rooms that reflect the reality of what we face every day,
Want to
right?
change.
And so that is the, I think, one of the big gaps that I see needs to be addressed. Like, what is the sensitization that we're creating for the 70% of people who are in leadership positions who are not women, right? So how do we do that? And so that's the big thing that I'm what's the word I've started thinking about, to say that we have the fact, it won't be perfect, it won't be 100%, but we have enough to have the conversations. How do we then create the forums and the right conversations in order to be able to have the decision makers and people who can effect change also be hearing the same kind of messages that we're talking about?
Interesting. I completely agree with that, especially around the fact that women networks, we talk to us, we're talking to ourselves, and at the moment maybe we are running around in circles, and we need to invite more people to the table to have this
Yes,
conversation if we're going to effect any change. Thank you so
yes.
much. For me, key takeouts from this conversation is around, I always thought that the big gap was actually in sort of the higher levels of leadership. Interesting to know that the problem is actually when women are entering the workforce, and I think that can actually be worrying, because it means that some of the improvements we're seeing now may not be sustained in the future. So going back to what you said around change that sticks, um,
Exactly.
really important. And the second thing for me is that around measurement and impact, and actually putting our legs in the fire, or the legs on the coal. Like, I forget how that adage goes, but really around, saying, okay, what are we measuring, and who is accountable for these things that we are measuring, if we're serious about it. And also sensitization is important. I think maybe we think everybody understands these issues, but maybe not as much. And when you look at it, if 27%, who is the 83%, it's really important. So rather than 73%, my maths is going off, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So
Yes, yes.
thank you so much, Maiwa. I know you're really super, super busy, doing a lot of work, but thank you for finding time to come and have this conversation with us, and just share your insights, not only around the report, but also your personal experience and thoughts around these key important issues. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a
You're
good
welcome.
evening.
Have a
Bye
good
bye.
evening. Thank you, everyone, for watching. All right. Bye.